most thinking people I know have had your books on hand during this pandemic. The Brutish Museums and Potential History, Unlearning Imperialism were two of the most important books for the past 2 years for art professionals. Dan makes an unequivocal case for restitution of looted art objects, and Arielle poses questions about the very nature of archives, including photographic and museum archives. Arielle Aïsha Azoulay is professor of modern culture and media at the Department of Comparative Literature, Brown University. Her most recent book is Potential History, Unlearning Imperialism, Verso 2019. Art Forum writes, the tools Azoulay proposes are potential precisely because of the way they implicate the faculty of imagination as a challenge to seemingly incontrovertible histories. Potential history might be best thought of as a theoretical companion to the interventionist strategies of groups like Decolonize This Place. Azoulay has written extensively on photography, and her films and film essays have shown at the Centre Pompidou, the Reina Sofia, and other major museums worldwide. Dan Hicks is professor of contemporary archaeology at the University of Oxford and curator of world archaeology at the Pitt Rivers Museum at the University of Oxford. His book, The Brutish Museums, The Benin Bronzes, Colonial Violence and Cultural Restitution, was published by Pluto Press in 2020. The Brutish Museums was listed as one of the New York Times best art books of 2020 with the recommendation, if you care about museums and the world, read this book. Thank you for being here today.
Lovely to be here.
Thank you. Happy to be here, and thank you for inviting us.
Perhaps I could start by asking you, Dan, what brought you to this book topic?
Right, absolutely. So, well, I've been here as curator, as you mentioned, for almost 14 years now. Let me share an image of this enormous, 1884 space, which is only about 80 yards away from me as I'm speaking to you now from my office at the Pitt Rivers. So 1884 is the year of the Berlin Congress. It's the year of the founding of this museum. It's also, as the book argues and observes, the year of the invention of the Maxim, which was the machine gun that was so important for the looting of Africa. And I think in my role as a curator here, of course, a part of that is to keep things, the same, to make sure that the fabrics are not eaten by moths and that the metalwork doesn't rust away. But a lot of curators have experienced a sort of mission creep in which they have thought that also their role is to seek to prevent the world from actually changing around this institution. So here, actually, over the 14 years that I have sort of worked here, the world really has changed, and as the book argues, sort of actually that was a big part of that was the effect of the Rose Must Fall Oxford movement in 2015. So I guess the real sort of reason I wrote the book was to work through that challenge, which was about the sense of the museum as an ongoing act of violence, that sense that a role for the museum, and for anthropology as a discipline from the 1890s onwards was to make sort of anti-Black violence and, if you like, sort of cultural dispossession last sort of into the times that we're living in now. So it's that unfinished nature of empire, which of course is also a thing that we learn, that I learned a lot about from Arielle's book.
And so we turn to Arielle's book. What brought you to your book topic, and what is the essential argument in your book?
I think that, while I'll share some of what Dan said, I think that, for me, it started in the fact that I was born in a settler colonial state. So prior to the museum, it was the place where I was born, a place that, let's say, transformed Palestine that was there before into, a kind of museum memory or museum object or something that should no longer exist. And I wear, I think, two hats. One of them is a political theorist. The other one is working with photography or objects. Or yeah. And I think that, when you are being born in a settler colonial state and you are being assigned the identity of the settlers, either you can become a settler or you can unlearn. So unlearning started, I think, as a mode of resisting the violence of the imperial state. And it became, a methodological project. It became, something that I theorize, not only in this book, but prior to this book in my previous books. And I think that what I am trying to do in this book, and is related to the fact that I was born in the settler colonial state, is that I was surrounded by objects and by images that were actually images and objects that were plundered, or that were confiscated, or that were transmuted, or that they were transformed. They were, changed their meanings, changed their status. And all these, actions on these objects and on this environment that was destroyed, like Palestine, it's not only the environment, it's the cosmology, it's traditions, many things. All this involved the life of objects. So for me, political theory became also a political theory of life shared with objects, not only with others. And what I'm trying to do in potential history is try to understand how photography that we have been taught was invented in the beginning of the 18th century, like in the late 30s of the 19th century, how photography actually was not born at that moment when a group of white scholars, inventors, claimed this invention as their own, but photography actually was invented much earlier, let's say with the invention or invasion of other parts of the world through imperial technologies. So what I'm trying to do in potential history is try to unlearn the technology of the museum, the technology of the archive, and the technology of photography, and to show that they are all based on the operation of the shutter. The shutter that we associate with the device of the camera actually was invented with the beginning, I think, of the invasion of what was called the New World, when imperial actors actually separated people from their environments, people from their occupations, people from their beliefs, people from their cosmologies, and people from their objects. And based on this, acts of violence, of separation, that became that. What was separated was institutionalized as if it existed for itself. This is how we ended up with museums where you encounter objects and the people are considered unrelated to those objects. So I came, I think, to write potential history based on, the experience of being born in a colonial state and understanding that this colonial state is actually the second colonial project by which I was impacted. Hence, what I'm trying to say by this, without getting into the detail, is that the process of unlearning imperialism is a very long process, and it can take entire life.
Dan, can you speak to the essential argument of your book, perhaps in relation to what Arielle just said, and also touch on how you did the research for your project?
I mean, I think, we've just heard about unlearning. We might think about the Sylvia Wynter notion of settling. In my case, this was about having recognized and been shown that the Anthropology Museum represents a sort of white infrastructure. That's how I, write about it. The idea that a certain worldview that was current in anthropology in the 1890s, in the early part of the last century, which wasn't a racism such as we would imagine for anthropology naturally, the physical anthropologists who lined up skulls on the shelves to tell the racist lie that there are different species of human. But actually, the thing that goes further or does something different, we can go to the observation by Fanon, where he talks about vulgar racism as being simply about the biological. But there's a cultural racism that was introduced as well, which he outlined, which of course we see in the Cultural Anthropology Museum. So, and so here in Oxford and in other, museums around the world, after the Second World War, here in the UK, after we beat the fascists, one of the first things that happened in the Natural History Museum was the removal of those racist displays that were not just telling those sort of lies; they were recognised as bad science. And yet, right next door, here in the Pitt Rivers, the objects of art and culture that had been used, put to work in order to tell precisely the same narrative, which was a supremacist narrative, actually were untouched. So the white infrastructure that we're talking about, that I guess, the book sort of argues, is something we see in Confederate statues that are placed across the way from the courthouse in the American sort of South, or indeed anthropology museums as they were sort of set up around that same time. So that sense in which there is actually quite a tight window of sort of history between the 1880s and the 1920s, in which art and culture, whether it's in the built environment outdoors or whether it's indoors in our museums, was being weaponized, was being used in order to celebrate anti-Black violence, and in order to make the violence last. So really the book sought to take the example of the Benin case, so the 150 objects we have from the 10,000 and more that were looted from Nigeria, or what is now Nigeria, in this immensely violent attack of 1897. And to tell that history, which had been misrepresented for so long, and to seek to start to, write a book as if I were seeking to remove an image from the streets in order to, writing as if to topple Edward Colston, because in fact, I attended my first event to remove Edward Colston in 1998. So when I was a doctoral student in the city, it was my generation that failed to remove Edward Colston, and that sort of kicked off the 25 years of sort of talk and nothing happening. And I could see the same things happening over restitution, a lot of dialogue and not much else. And so a South African colleague actually recently said to me, colonialism used to be that you told me you're inferior. Today, colonialism is that you tell me that I'm in a dialogue. And that sense of so much of the attempts to dismantle as just being talking shops, the kicking things along the road was of course the whole point, because the white supremacists of that time, they obviously sort of knew what they were doing. It was obvious that to put sort of art and culture, intervene in that way, it's incredibly hard to take those things apart. So that's what the book really does. It seeks to sort of use my own esoteric sort of knowledge as someone that works in a museum to share that information and to make the case for the return of these objects.
Can you speak briefly about the Rhodes Must Fall protests of 2015 in relation to your investigation?
So it was in the, what the Rhodes Must Fall movement was and was something that came out in the Cape Town sort of campus at UCT. And it happened at a moment at which there was a generation of students who were born after the end of apartheid. It ended in 1994. This was 2015, and yet institutional racism was there in their everyday lives. And at the heart of the campus was this image of Rhodes, the mass murderer, the founder of what ended up as South Africa, Zimbabwe, Rhodesia, of course, was named after him. He was a mass murderer. He was a diamond miner. He founded the South African company, which was the South Africa version of the Royal Niger Company that was at the heart of the attacks in the context of the Nigerian sort of histories. So in the fall of that year, because Rhodes also endowed the sort of funding here at Oxford that's able to bring African scholars here every year, these colleagues arrived, in a university where empire also wasn't over, and where there was an image of Rhodes outside Oriel, which here at the university, a college, but also there were other examples of empire continuing. There's a library named after Codrington, who was a Caribbean slaver from the 17th century, and also, of course, there was this institution. So the Rhodes Must Fall Oxford movement at a key moment in October 2015, actually sent a message over social media that said that the Pitt Rivers Museum is one of the most violent spaces in Oxford. And I had never seen it that way. I'd been working at the museum for some time at that point, and it had never been explained to me that it wasn't just that we had to work with the source communities. We'd undertaken the returns of human remains to First Nations and to Native American groups and to Maori and Aboriginal Australia. And yet, in the context of extractive colonialism in Africa, we hadn't realized that the displays of these objects, which are sacred objects, they're royal objects, they don't just constitute ancestors, they represent, they don't just represent ancestors, they actually, constitute them. That is an act of violence every time that we open the doors of the museum.
Reading potential history and the Brutish museums here in Hawaii has helped me understand our own ongoing relationship to colonial violence. You're both authors who use the term violence to describe things people don't ordinarily see as violent, such as photographs, archives, museums. Can you speak about the role of violence in the work you do? How can silent or tacit objects be violent or do violence? And can we start with Arielle?
When we speak about violence, there are different types of violence, and some of them are more visible than others. And in potential history, what I'm interested in is the way that violence is being reproduced, and the way that it's being reproduced and being naturalized, normalized, legalized, and also embraced in different liberal professions. So when I'm thinking, for example, about, museum goers, when I'm thinking about photographers, I'm thinking about curators, scholars in the academia, we inherited so many gestures, so many procedures that are actually so violent, but we inherited them as if they are part of benign practices or benign technologies. So when, for example, we look at this and, deliberately chosen an image that is earlier than, the catastrophe, the series of punitive expeditions then that you are speaking about, in your book, alongside the Benin punitive expedition. And I wanted, to bring something that is a little bit earlier to show, how, what we know from Benin, the images, the photographic images of the overt violence, as many precedents for many, many centuries. So here we are at the end of the 18th century, the beginning of the 19th century. Napoleon arrives with, 35,000, soldiers to Egypt and invade Egypt. And what he does when he invades Egypt is actually opening up many things that should have never been opened up, for study, for draftsmen like here, to be copied, to be circulated, to be transported, and to be exposed to light, right? Like, for example, the mummies had never been supposed to be, open up. So here we are looking at, very beautiful, drawings. And we can really, valorize them. We can speak about, the hand. We can speak about the gesture. We can speak about, shadow and light. We can speak about many things. But what we forget when we look at it is what made them to appear so beautiful. What made them to appear so beautiful is exactly this technology of the shutter that I spoke about earlier, because each of them was, detached or was uprooted from the context in which it lived, and it became an object for, the gaze of the draftsman. So we can go from this image to just a second, I don't know why. Okay, so when we look at this, painting, we see more about the violence, right? We see the violence not only of creating, of removing architectonic elements and making them, object of the gaze of the artist, but we see how human are being transformed into type. We see our local people, our indigenous, are being forced to collaborate, to labor for these actions of opening the mummies. We see the painter giving instructions, right? Because he is the guy who has a vision of how the situation should be depicted. So here we see a little bit the behind the scene of this image. But we don't have photographs like we have here, right, of the degree or the scale of destruction that was required in order to produce this kind of image. So what I'm trying to do in Potential History in the book when I'm relating to violence is, of course, studying, different occurrences of violence, but also violence as part of the regime, part of the political regime, part of the regime of the museum. And by that, I'm trying to suspend the exact date, for example, here of each and every image, not because it is not important, but I would like to show destruction as part of democratic regimes, part of the Western understanding of what is politics. So even though we don't have these images, these photographs in relation to Egypt, we have to assume that in each and every place where, invaders entered and opened it up for scholarship or for art, practices, this what preceded. And when we look at these kind of images of destruction, what interests me, again, in Potential History, is to understand that on the basis of this destruction, or the destruction is the stage on which imperialism could impose new taxonomies. And when I'm speaking about new taxonomies, we, of course, can think about art or art objects, because all these objects that were plundered were not, as Dan also mentioned earlier, were not meant necessarily to be objects of art, right? So destruction enabled the imposition of new taxonomy. So my question in the book, or the effort, is trying to understand why, when we look at these kind of structures, like here taken, for example, a series of postcards in Algeria after the invasion of Algeria in 1830, why, when we look at these kind of buildings that are standing alone, why we don't see this violence? Because each of them is the outcome of violence, because the environment was destroyed, and one structure was singled out and became the topic of a postcard. So as you can see, what interests me is the way that violence is being reproduced through benign forms or benign practices. Or when we look, for example, at this photograph that was taken of a Zulu girl by George Washington, what interests me is how I can resist becoming a scholar of photography, even though this is what I am, partially at least, a scholar of photography, how to resist to become a scholar of photography and not to study the epistemological violence of how people were taken in photographs, but to understand that the mere fact that photography invaded South Africa is related to another punitive expedition and to the expropriation of objects and their plunder into the British Museum. You see the different necklaces that she's wearing, and you will see them at the British Museum, but also you have to think about it in relation to this shield that was confiscated, which means that when we are looking at this kind of image, we'd have to think not only about the epistemological violence, but about the ontological violence of the destruction of Zulu culture, the destruction of the Zulu kingdom, which was one of the strongest in South Africa, which enabled the invasion of photography, the invasion through photography also to this culture. And maybe I'll end with this image because it will lead me later to maybe to the question that you will ask us, as you said, about archives. And here is an image that I like to dwell on it and to look at those gestures that I'm speaking about, how we inherited them. So this is, an image of two plunderers. We call them collectors in many anthologies. In the discourse of art, but actually we are looking at, let's say, the process of plunder. And I'm, again, resisting to be a scholar of photography. I always allow myself to intervene in photographs. So rather than looking at this image in its entirety, let's crop it. So I crop the image, and hence I can see more than what I can see when the image is in its entirety. So when I'm looking at this close-up of the image, this crop, so look at the gesture that we know from each and every museum, the gesture of the connoisseur, the way that gently the object is being held, right? But what interests me in this crop is that not only we see this gesture, but we see the presence of another hand, the hand of this young man who is actually there not only in order to transport this object to the port to be transported to New York from Congo, but he is there because without his presence, these collectors, these plunderers will not be able to know what is the meaning of the object. So what we see here is not only the act of the physical plunder of the object, in the same way that with the drawings from the Napoleonic expedition, it was plunder not through the direct seizure of the object. Here it's a direct seizure of the objects, but also draining this man here on the right from his knowledge, but not only draining his knowledge in order for these guys to become scholars of Congolese art, but also keeping him outside of the discourse. So we see everything in this kind of tiny, image that I cropped from the bigger image about how plunder operates not only as a technology of expropriation of objects, but also expropriation of knowledge, also the construction or the constitution of white actors as scholars, as masters of these objects.
Thank you. And can we turn the question over to Dan to speak about the role of violence in the work that you do and how objects can be violent or do violent or violence, or perhaps in your case also the technology of the museum. How is that violent?
So objects like this, that we see on the book cover, it's hard to imagine them initially as if this is a violent act, and so often the museums have described themselves as sort of saving and as institutions of care. And I think in the writing of the book, the thing that really, dawned on me and the book seeks to start a conversation about is how the narratives over care, over preservation, over that notion of keeping things safe wasn't a response that's separate from the military looting. It was absolutely hand in hand with it. So there were forms of violence in the act of war that sought to take away sovereignty, to destroy traditional religion, to remove culture, to dispossess art and culture and history. A lot of these objects, in the case of the Benin sort of case, are in part archives. They're objects that have an iconography that tells the detailed history of each of the obas, of the kings of Benin. So there's that, but then there's also in order to build on what we just heard, there's also a relationship actually with the photographic. So here is the non-zoomed version of an image that we saw a moment ago on the right-hand side, which is in the Pitt Rivers collections that shows the looting as it happens. Here's another image on the left-hand side that we very rarely see, which is also in the Pitt Rivers, which is the sheer desecration of this sort of sacred royal site. So this is an urban landscape, a sacred urban landscape that was part of a kingdom that had existed for more than 600 years, that, in which each of the obas, as they had lived in a palace that's then abandoned after their death and is turned into a site for worship. And the burning down of the villages and the killing of so many people outside of the city, but also the absolutely razing this to the ground and the looting of objects by, say, sort of 200 of the soldiers and the sailors and administrators simply for their own gain, sort of personally. So this wasn't an official looting. This was just a free-for-all. That is not simply the fact that happens, that bad thing happens, and then the museum helps out. The fact that these objects were on display in Berlin, in Oxford, in London, actually within weeks of this attack, meant that the taking and the displaying was not some sort of some simply a positive thing, a saviorism thing. It was a part of that violence. And the taking here, the book goes into how the taking of photographs has this relationship to the taking of objects. So it's very weird that they took so many photographs at the same point as they were removing all these objects. So the book expands on a fight I picked in an edited volume I did on archaeology and the photographic, where I seek to make a break with the conventional account of the photograph that we get from Susan Sontag or from Roland Barthes or from John Berger, who in the 70s and 80s made this analogy with archaeology. They would often say that the photograph is like a fragment of time. It's like an archaeological object that has frozen time and something you're then able to rediscover and sort of re-experience. Whereas for me as an archaeologist, that isn't what an artifact is at all. An artifact from the past is not a frozen moment of time. It's an endurance. It's a duration. And there's something about the act of exposure, the role of exposure in the photographic as a duration, and the role of the museum as a tool of visuality and a tool that is that's an intervention with sort of time. And the conceit of the museum is that time has stopped, but of course time is simply slowed. I often think of the space, I can't help but feel that the space of the Pitt Rivers has a sense of a sort of a photographic aperture, that you're in a space that's looking, and of course, as we know, things can become overexposed, and if they're overexposed, you see nothing. So there's a whole set of ways in which I think those things are going on, and the acts of violence happen then not only through the camera, and of course, I absolutely agree about the earlier histories that lead in, and I'm so inspired by Arielle's account of those earlier histories of the photographic, or the earlier histories, the pre-histories. And of course, there are pre-histories of archaeology in the form of antiquarianism as well. There's also, though, this moment in the 1830s where archaeology and photography almost emerge hand in hand. And for me, the invention of photography in the 1830s has a relationship as a sort of a precondition for archaeology as we know it now, because there is something about enduring time that's there. So it's, for me, the sort of challenge is to see these displays on the left-hand side here are the objects on display in London at the British Museum. These are the Benin things that they have. And then on the right-hand side here is our display at the Pitt Rivers, which shows the wide sort of range of objects, not only the bronzes, but also you can just about see actually in the tusk on the bottom right-hand side that it's burnt. And that's the burning of a sacred object from the looting. There's the burning along the top of that tusk at the bottom right-hand side. So understanding these displays as violence, for me, involves a shift away from the 90s anthropology reflexive turn, the Jim Cliffords and the George Marcuses, who sold us a way of addressing the role of the museum, the idea of the museum as a contact zone, which, ultimately recentered the white curator, and of course, often the male white curator. Except this time the curator was really sensitive and self-critical and was trying to do the right thing. Actually, I would absolutely not argue against the sort of that 90s sense that these displays in our museums, objectify, they create a narrative, fake narrative of the primitive. They are, violent in that sense in creating alterity. But I think at that time, I think now we have to recognize that in the galleries, they're doing something else on the other side of the glass. So as you walk through the Pitt Rivers or any other world culture museum like it, you are flaneuring from one culture to another. You're on the living side of the glass. So in the 1890s, what was actually happening was the racialization of the curator and of the visitor as white. So that sort of cultural whiteness that is enacted in the gallery space is what this form of violence looks like. And that's why the physical dismantling, it isn't enough for me to state my privilege at a rich institution and my maleness and my whiteness. It isn't enough for me to talk about my positionality in this institution, in this conversation. My role now has to be to undermine myself. And that's why the book talks about excavating where we stand, to take apart not just the statue, but the podium, in which one finds oneself, in these museums, if you're someone like me. So that physical dismantling in all its forms, which is about undoing the sheer whiteness of these institutions and ensuring that we look more like the communities and stakeholders that we say we serve, but it also involves the acts of return, actually, when that is asked and when that is what is wanted. So I've got more to say on the archive, but that hopefully answers the violence question.
So moving to the archive and that very topic, not to date myself, but when I was attending college in the 1990s, I learned to love a notion of the archive that I think was based on the sense of an archive as a site of potential resistance, coming from some of the works of Michel Foucault, in which a historian or art historian could discover genealogies within the archive that could help us act against the normative and oppressive present. And reading both of your books obviously made me question that very theoretical model of thinking. Could you each speak to the different models of the archive you address in your work, and the theoretical lineage of your particular thinking about the archive, perhaps starting with Arielle?
So here we are again in this image of the archivist. So what I got to understand through the writing of the book is that not only we have to question the genealogy of the museum, not only we have to unlearn or undo the nation state, etc., but also the institution of the archive. And I think that in the last couple of decades, especially through different artistic projects, we got to, fetishize a little bit the archive as an institution. And what I'm trying to do in Potential History is trying to understand the archive as a technology, and not only a technology, but a technology of violence. So what we see here, for example, in this image, that if you remember, is a crop from this image. We see Hilton Simpson on the left, nearby Torday. And what we see is that we see him writing, or we see him documenting, this ideology of the documentary. We see him documenting the objects that are being plundered at that moment. But let's think about it as the documents that we are going to the archive in order to read. So rather than thinking about the archive as the institution in which documents are being, entrusted or deposited or kept or preserved, or whichever verb you would like to use, like we see here in those, this series of images of archivists that, will do everything, even climbing on a ladder, in order to find the ultimate document that will tell them the truth about something, while, as I showed in earlier images in relation to your question about violence, we see that imperial violence takes place in the open. As then you said earlier, why did they take so many photographs? Because imperial actors are documenting ceaselessly their violence. So rather than thinking about, the archivist as really the kind of ants or laboring tediously, I started to look at different type of archivists. So here you see, an Israeli soldier with pile of documents. So part of these documents will be dumped. Another part will be kept in the archive, and another part will be kept in the military in order to understand the secrets of those that the state expropriate from their lands, from their objects, etc. So for me, these are the archivists. Here you see a group of soldiers. They plundered, bunch of photographs, and they are looking at them. And I would like to relate, this persona of the archivist, the persona of the archivist that exercise violence, to another type of document, which are the most, let's say, official documents through which violence is being legalized. So here, for example, you see another type, of my intervention in photographs, where I covered with black ink most of the image. And I kept mainly one document. And this is the document by which the State of Israel was declared existing. This is the Declaration of the State of Israel. But what I read in this document is actually the proclamation that Palestine no longer exists. And if you understand the archive in continuity between the violence that is being exercised directly by plundering and expropriating others from their documents, by transforming or by forcing people to inhabit categories like refugees or like slaves, etc., and you connect them to those documents that then we are going to look for them in the archive, through which imperial temporality is being imposed, right? Because from May 48, people were no longer allowed, actually, or were no longer socialized to speak about Palestine, but to speak only about Israel, because Palestine was proclaimed over. So here, you see another set of archivists. So you already recognize him. This is another archivist. And here what you see are images. This is a crop that I took from an image of enslavement. And you see that enslavement was not only the exercise of direct violence on the bodies of people who were kidnapped, but the fact that they became slaves was also are recorded in papers that then we are being interpolated to go to the archive and study them. So for me, studying the archive, looking at the archive, was also an attempt to unlearn what the archive expects from us, to cherish these documents, to see in these documents the ultimate proof for something that we are looking for, and which actually deviates us from studying the way that we inherited those gestures, the way that we inherited love even to objects that are objects of violence because they were plundered and looted, etc.
So I think, that was absolutely wonderful, Arielle. And I think that sense of the archive and its sort of relationship to violence has so much more depth in the way that you're describing it there than we would get from a Foucauldian analysis. I want to try to build on that a bit, and also to introduce a bit of optimism as well, in terms of what we do from within the museum. Obviously, my book is the whole nature of the gesture of the book is to seek to reframe the restitution debate from one that is for those people outside the museum who want things to be returned, and those inside the museum to resist it, to say, well, actually, that isn't the world we live in anymore. Many in the museum world are open to restitution. Actually, returns are already a part of the normal operation of American and European museums in the cases of Holocaust spoliation, in the cases of the return of ancestral human remains for Indigenous and First Nations and Native American claimants. So, but where does that leave the archive? Where does that leave my role as a curator? So I use Achille Mbembe's rewriting of the notion of the Foucauldian notion of the biopolitical as a way of trying to solve the problem I had when writing the book, which is so many of the basic framings or idioms that I would use, the theories I would normally use, as an anthropologist, as an art historian for writing about objects, was simply inappropriate in this context. So maybe the most obvious one is the idea of the social life of things, of the cultural sort of life of an object. So in these cases of the Benin objects, it seemed wholly inappropriate to reach back to an 80s model of the recontextualization of things, as if the Benin objects were simply moving from one context to another and having another layer added to their lives. It's having another meaning, attributed sort of to them. These are histories of loss and histories of death. So what Mbembe does with the Foucauldian notion of the biopolitical is he says, in the context of forced migration from Africa and of fortress Europe and the sheer numbers of Africans and those from the Middle East who die every year in the Mediterranean, seeking simply to move around the planet in the context of violence, of environmental change, and so on. The notion of the politics of life that Foucault wrote into institutions like hospitals or prisons needs to be reframed from the biopolitical into the necropolitical. So Mbembe's account of the necropolitical, which is the politics of who lives and who dies, maybe we need something like that for objects and for museums. So I introduced the notion of the necrographic, the writing, as another way of talking about the provenance histories that we have to do in order to start the process of unmaking our museums, to understand the histories of taking. And I guess sort of tied to that is what I call a Euro-pessimism, the idea that for as long as I am a curator here, looking at an object that has been claimed by a source community, by a nation, by its rightful owners, and that object is not being returned, the only history I can write is the history of loss. Is this, as an archaeologist, I can just excavate this layer that's on top of what this object means, which is ash and death, and it's filled with all that loss. That's the history we need to tell in order to start to return objects. And so there's a piece that I wrote, a short piece that introduces that, and there's a link there to see some of the responses to that idea in this issue of the British Art Studies. But I'd also say I've been very inspired, as well as by Arielle's work on the photographic, by Nick Mizov's work on sort of visuality, and the account he made in 2017 of modes of visuality in relation to the BLM movement. So his book, which you can get online as a free download, looks at the deaths sort of not in the most recent sort of phase of this ongoing anti-racist struggle, but in the context of 2014 to 2017. And so Eric Garner and Michael Brown, their deaths having a relationship, and in terms of the moment that came up out of them and the acts of resistance that came out, they were events that relied upon a shift in the technologies of the visual. And so Nick argues, and he uses Hannah Arendt here. I'm not sure we need Hannah Arendt in order to do this, but he argues that it is the dash cam footage and the cell phone footage that made visible anti-Black violence that had been happening for centuries, and made that sort of knowledge shareable, that created a political moment around the visual. So this is about saying his name. This is about the documentation. And for someone that works in a museum world that has been so focused on interpretation rather than description, might this mean that there's a sort of anti-Blackness, a sort of a counterinsurgency, and these are the terms that Nick's sort of using, that could mean something in the context of the museum. And I was very struck, actually, just earlier this week, by the comments in the wake of the verdict of the George Floyd trial by the Attorney General in Minnesota, who said that this isn't justice, but it is accountability, which is a first step towards justice. So in museums, as we start to hope that some sort of restorative justice, hand in hand with a sort of reckoning with the colonial violent nature and white supremacist nature of our museums, what is it that someone like me can do in this, without sort of taking up space, without reinscribing violence, while seeking, as I say, to undermine myself? How can what does that sort of look like? So the book seeks to make a contribution by using my esoteric knowledge of how to research the death histories of these objects by saying, here's where all the Benin objects are. Here are the 150 institutions, including more than 38 we now know, because since I published the list, other people have found some, have they written to me, and we'll update this in the next edition. All the Ivy League schools, which include sort of Dartmouth and Harvard, Brown and Penn and so on, all the regional museums. I mean, all these objects are not in the British Museum. They're in over 150 museums around the world. So listing, maybe that's something I can do while sort of simultaneously sharing that knowledge with the Nigerians who are making the claims and seeking to amplify their voices and encourage my sector to take those calls sort of seriously. And we are now seeing, absolutely not because of me, but because of the long-standing African movement for restitution that's 100 years old, and the work towards around the 100-year anniversary in 1997 that happened here in the UK, led by Bernie Grant MP. As we approach the 125th anniversary next year in the February of 2022, of this attack in 1897, we're now seeing the University of Aberdeen, we're seeing movements in Berlin, we're seeing movements from a whole host of institutions, from the Fowler Museum at UCLA to the National Museum Ireland, all making a commitment to return their objects. So there's maybe some hope there that the archive, or the act of archiving, or rewriting the archive, inventing archives, so the making lists, there is a politics sort of to that, whereby maybe we can, I don't know, maybe this is optimistic, but maybe some of the skill sets that are in museums for knowing where things are can be shared, can be, democratized, so the knowledge is in the hands of the claimants, and they increasingly the agency on this question is in Nigerian hands and not in the hands of the Europeans who have held on to knowledge for so long.
I'd like to transition a bit back to the issue of photography and the sort of material way photography fits in with your particular publication projects, because your work speaks to so many urgent contemporary art practices today. I think of Walid Rod, Stephanie Sujuko, who we just did a show with here at the University of Hawaii at Manoa this spring, and Cameron Rowland, to name three. You use photography in your books, Dan. You place images of the atrocities of the Benin expedition of 1897 throughout the Brutish museums without caption. We've seen a few of those images today. And Arielle, you reproduce drawings of images that you were refused permission to reproduce because of your refusal to reprint the captions that went along with the images. And you also write about untaken photographs of rape after World War II, and talk about categories of inaccessible and unshowable photographs as well, and potential history. And you've written extensively on photography. Can you speak to the relation of images to captions, to text in your books, and to your refusal or use of photographs in particular? Let me start with Arielle.
Yes. So, in between, the civil contract of photography that I wrote many, many years ago, and the civil, it's already, I think, 20 years, and potential history, what I came to understand is that we are the way that photography was institutionalized is as if the photographs are at the heart of the practice of photography, but what actually we are experiencing with photography are many very different things, oftentimes in the absence of photographs. So either photographs were not taken, or photographs were not, returned to the people from whom they were seized. So the idea that, that we is encapsulated in this kind of, a simple sentence, a photographer took a photograph, this idea of linearity of photography is a completely false idea. And, when I studied many years ago the creation of the State of Israel through the destruction of Palestine, and I studied rape in this context, and I had students who studied rape in the partition of India, Pakistan, and I studied rape in the context of the end of World War II. I realized that actually we have tons of images from the end of World War II, but we have no images of rape. And we are speaking in Germany as part of ending the war about the rape of in between 1 million and 2 million German women. And it's when I'm saying that there are no images of rape, it's not that I'm expecting to encounter or that will be published millions of images of torn bodies of women. But the fact that we have tons of images that created or shaped our visual imaginary of what is the end of World War II, to the point that, we still speak about World War II as if in its entirety it was a war against the Nazi or the fascist regime, while we know that it was part of it, at least the last 2-3 years, from the European point of view, was how to shape the world in order to accommodate it to the perpetuation of the neoliberal plunder of different people around the globe. So when I realized that actually among those millions of photographs from the end of World War II, there are no images of rape, I started to ask myself, what does it mean that so many photographers, let me show, were there and we don't have any access to the fact that between 1 million and 2 million women were raped. So let's very briefly look at this image that I called it, rather than, an image of X or Y or Z, I call it an untaken photograph of rape. Why? Because we have here 3 cameras, and those 3 cameras didn't yield anything related to rape. We have the very famous photographer at the front. We have another photographer taking him in a photograph, which, can give us, the sentiment of how the figure of the photographer was at the center of interest. And we have also a third photographer, the photographer who took this photograph, right? So we see on 1 meter square meter, we see 3 photographers, and in their cameras, either there are undeveloped images of rape or they didn't take images. So I call it untaken images of rape. And why do I call this an untaken image of rape? Because rape took place all over where these photographers roam around. So what I'm trying to develop with these notions that undermine the idea that the archive or photography is about the photograph as a document, I'm trying to say that when we don't have images of violence that took place somewhere, we have other images through which we can decipher the visual existence of this violence. So let me go back to this image and I will end with it. This is from an exhibition that I did, The Natural History of Rape. And what you see here are 8 books opened in the page where the rape of women is mentioned in one page. I single out 1 or 2 lines from those texts and I transformed it into a caption. And the caption accompanies black squares that stand for, like placeholders in the archive, for the untaken images of rape. So this is what I can say to conclude in between the archive and the notion of how to work with the archive against the premises of the archive.
I mentioned the Rose Must Fall movement in Cape Town earlier, and I just want to contrast this image with this one from my friend Tom Flower, taken in the aftermath of those protests, the empty plinth, and to think about what it means to, sort of dismantle what it means for us to begin to take apart these spaces in relation to the sort of ways of thinking we've just been hearing about from Arielle, which are so incredibly important. That sense of not looking or not seeing, that sense of violence as not having to be represented in that way for it to be felt and acknowledged and sort of remembered, because our museums are, memory institutions. And, around the restitution debate, there's a lot of nonsense that we hear about from the where will it endists and the whataboutists, who will say that the question of the return of the bronzes, of other objects, is is iconoclastic. It's an attack upon the museums. You're going to shut the museum down, empty it out. So I prefer to see these acts, which we learn from in the renewal and the refreshment of our cities and our universities in terms of the historic built environment. How we can learn from those in our museums is about the driving of some sort of wedge into the institution of the museum, into its white infrastructure, that will not only, give back when asked, it will also open up a space. And it's a space that doesn't need an interpretation board. I mean, it doesn't need to be seen. It needs a change of tone. It needs a shift in what the museum is, or maybe what it can be. Because the museum, I've sort of written a great deal about how I understand objects as events. I've already said that I see the photograph as a duration. Well, each object as well is an event and an unfinished event. I'd say the same about the museum. We don't know how this ends. There's an argument that we've never needed something like a World Culture Museum, an anthropology museum, some space where we're able to recognize and celebrate art outside of a Eurocentric lens, some sense of a public space for anthropology, if we can change anthropology to such a degree that it fulfills its anti-racist potential and completely, burns down all of the things that it is continuing to perpetuate from empire. So if any of that's going to happen, if what some are calling the decolonization of museums, and which I argue is in fact sort of best understood, not least in a European context, where actually the decolonial does not have that sense of stolen land as much as stolen art, stolen lives, stolen environment, and so on. Actually, we need to see it as anti-colonialism. We need to see it as the unfinished work of anti-racism in our institutions. If that's the case, then we can maybe, there's a chance that the reason we're talking about the Anthropology Museum here in Europe is that, a bit like in the civil rights movement in North America in the 60s and 70s, a part of what happened in the museums and the heritage sector was a recognition that racism is not just some random thing that everyone feels from time to time and needs to keep a control of, that racism has a history. And in the context of North America, that history is a history of enslavement. It's a history of the Confederacy. So therefore, it was important, if you went to Williamsburg or to the Jefferson House or whatever, that the history of African Americans was actually acknowledged, that sort of more generally, Indigenous history was sort of written and understood and appreciated. Well, actually, half a century on, maybe we're at another phase of the reckoning with the fact that racism has a history, because exactly as in the South African sense, it's still here. So we in Europe need to find our version of the intergenerational moment where apartheid is over and yet institutional racism's here. I think what we're seeing now with the announcement of the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in the Swiss and the Belgian context in relation to empire, in terms of the Macron reports, the Bénédicte Savoy and the Felwine Sarr arguments, that restitution is a question of reckoning with consent. There's an interesting link to what Arielle was just saying, sort of there, that the taking of objects and consent and where they are now having that sort of a relationship is important. This is part of a wider European reckoning with the fact that sort of racism has a history, but that history for Europe is not purely, although it is significantly a history of enslavement, it's also a history of empire more generally. So our museums have a potential to be spaces that are sites of conscience, that are spaces where we can remember. They are war zones. I'm sitting here yards away from human remains of the black and the brown bodies that found their way into the museum under colonialism. You know, you've only got to look at what's going on at Harvard, at what's going on in the Penn context in terms of a reckoning with the physical ancestral remains which are which remain in the physical anthropology museums. So much of this is about what's in the stores as well as actually what's on display. So for the cultural objects, we need the empty plinths, and we need to find the way of letting go of the curatorial authority that constantly wants to rewrite the label, to reinterpret, to tell the history sort of better, more honestly, more critically. That's wrong. We need to let go. We need to simply share the knowledge, open the doors, and allow stakeholders and source communities and our audiences and our wider communities to help us work out what we do with our anthropology museums in the present.
Thank you both so much for your generous gift of your time. I have so many more questions for both of you and could go on, but we've already gone well over time. And this has been one of the highlights of my academic life and short life as a museum curator and director here. So I really can't thank you enough.